Okay. So I have this scripted out, and if I'm speaking really fast and you can't comprehend, feel free to step in and try and get me to slow down. And hopefully we can follow. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So pivotal mental states is the title of our article. And our paper presents a process-based approach to psychological transformation, where a background of chronic stress predisposes an individual to a pivotal mental state, or PiMS for short. And acute stress triggers this pivotal mental state. The pivotal mental state itself is characterized by elevated cortical plasticity, an enhanced rate of associative learning, and an enhanced capacity to mediate psychological transformation. This state might then lead to rapid and profound psychological change. One thing we try to stress in our paper is that similar processes of psychological transformation can lead to extremely divergent outcomes. The example we focused most on here is the relationship between spiritual experience and psychosis. So both share common phenomenological features, such as anomalous self-experience, which relates to both mystical experience and anxiety-inducing ego dissolution. Both feature unusual perceptual experiences. These could be hallucinations or pseudo-hallucinations. A third shared feature would be magical thinking, which implicates prayer, rituals, beliefs in divine intervention or karma. In psychosis, we tend to think of beliefs in mind reading, clairvoyance, delusions of control, etc. The fourth feature I'll mention here is increased emotional tone. And generally, we think of spiritual experience as featuring positive emotions and psychosis as dominated by negative emotions. But in the incipient phases of a psychosis or a spiritual struggle, there can be a lot of overlap of positive and negative emotional states. Mania, for instance, can be laden with positive emotions at first, and then increasingly manifest fear and paranoia. In addition to comparing discrete spiritual experience and transient psychotic episodes, we highlight that these common phenomenological features are present in trait schizotypy and trait spirituality as well. So there is a positive correlation between trait spirituality and positive schizotypy. And positive schizotypy is comprised of the magical thinking and unusual perception subscales of the schizotypy construct. And we know that positive schizotypy is related to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, namely hallucinations and delusions. So many scholars have noticed that spiritual experiences and psychosis share these similar features. And in fact, the relationship appears fairly blatant and obvious. We think that this relationship is obscured by our tendency to focus on the divergent outcomes of spiritual experience and psychosis. So both psychosis and spiritual experience are partially defined by their functional outcomes or probable functional outcomes. So retroactively, we can say that person was struggling but had a life-saving spiritual experience, or, oh, that person was struggling and then went completely nuts. And we designate these experiences as spiritual or psychotic based largely upon their outcomes. And this outcome-based criteria is explicitly acknowledged in the Western Christian tradition, where a spiritual experience must bear fruits or be healthy and life-giving to be considered a spiritual experience. This implies that a person's spiritual experience and the beliefs resulting from such an experience conform to the norms of a particular group of outside observers. In contrast, psychotic experience and schizotypy in general are characterized by nonconformist beliefs and behaviors. Now, none of this is to say that the outcome of a pivotal mental state is completely unpredictable. So for instance, the duration and intensity of a pivotal mental state is important. The longer the duration and intensity of psychotic-like phenomena, the greater the increase in distress and cognitive disorganization. In turn, increased distress will amplify psychotic-like phenomena and negative affect. So a vicious cycle can emerge between distress and psychotic-like symptomology. In contrast, we tend to think of spiritual experiences as resolving distress and as relatively transient. It is also worth highlighting that there are similarities between the schizophrenia prodrome, which is the period of months to years preceding a conspicuous psychotic episode in schizophrenia, and what is sometimes described as a spiritual quest. So the schizophrenia prodrome is characterized partially by a lack of pleasure and motivation associated with typical recreation, social interactions, and vocational pursuits. And this in itself is similar to depression, but one difference is that in longer prodromes, there is increased interest in spiritual, paranormal, and ritual domains. William James, in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, notices this and describes how anhedonia in a subset of hyper-reflective individuals can lead to the meaningful belief in a concealed reality. Here, James is kind of describing the schizophrenia prodrome, which is characterized by hyper-reflexivity or increased self-consciousness and interest in what are sometimes called overvalued ideas. So on the right, I have a picture of Francis of Assisi, who was apparently a worldly, wealthy, and successful young man. Then he dropped everything in the pursuit of religious goals. As the myths tell it, Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha, followed a similar trajectory, giving up a life of luxury for spiritual pursuits. So here we are just hinting at some of the similarities between spiritual quests and the schizophrenia prodrome. Now, the typical manic psychotic trajectory is in some ways quite different. In mania, pleasure and motivation associated with typical recreation, social interaction, and vocational pursuits is often increased. And only as the mania progresses do spiritual themes emerge. Now, of course, there are all numbers of intermediate schizoaffective phenotypes, but this dichotomy will make more sense when we address the neuropharmacology of psychosis in a little bit. So, recapping, we can see that in addition to spiritual experience and psychosis displaying similar features, the behavioral and psychological changes in the periods leading up to these experiences may also be quite similar. Now to move on to the causes of these experiences. In our paper, we focus on stress. Cognitive, social, and physiological stress regularly precedes psychosis and spiritual experience. We have already mentioned how the schizophrenia prodrome resembles a depressive phenotype, and neurotic individuals are also more likely to develop a psychotic disorder. Social stress is another big one. The social defeat model of schizophrenia, for instance, posits that reduced social status related to ethnicity, aptitude, and other individual characteristics increases vulnerability to schizophrenia. Social isolation also produces psychotic-like features, for instance, in individuals placed in solitary confinement. Physiological stressors, such as starvation and metabolic dysfunction, hypoxia or a lack of oxygen, and sleep deprivation are also associated with psychosis. Now, all of these stressors seem to upregulate expression of serotonin 2A receptors, as inferred by mRNA and protein analysis in postmortem brain tissue, as well as imaging studies of receptor binding in humans. Some of these stressors, particularly social stressors, also seem to sensitize the 2A receptor in animal models. So for instance, rat pups separated from their mums will show greater response to psychedelics later in life. And we know that the serotonin 2A receptor mediates the main subjective effects of classic psychedelics. So LSD, psilocybin, DMT, etc. Now, there is maybe no experimental research that shows a causal link between stress and spiritual experience, but the same stressors that often precede psychosis and potently upregulate serotonin 2A receptor expression also precede spiritual experiences. Despair and depression regularly precede spiritual experience, as does social isolation and social loss. So for example, the death of a loved one. But the most compelling evidence that stress facilitates spiritual experience is the intentional use of ascetic practices to induce spiritual experience. For thousands of years, people from all different cultures have practiced fasting, sleep deprivation, social isolation, self-mortification, extreme exercise routines, and temperature manipulation in order to induce spiritual experiences. These are cross-cultural and universal practices. The likelihood that there is a biological basis for how these practices induce spiritual experiences is very high. Supporting this notion, the same stressors that are intentionally utilized for spiritual purposes are also utilized in torture and reliably produce psychotic-like experiences. I didn't realize this when I put the picture of Francis of Assisi on the previous slide, but apparently his spiritual breakthrough came after he was taken prisoner on a military expedition and experienced severe illness. On the right, there is a sculpture of the emaciated Buddha who reportedly reached enlightenment after a period of intense fasting. And our paper goes into much more detail regarding how various stressors upregulate serotonin 2A receptor expression and activity. Okay, so recapping where we're at now. We propose that stress-induced psychosis and spiritual experience is mediated by upregulation and then activation of serotonin 2A receptors. We feel comfortable proposing this because we have known for a long time that psychedelics induce psychotic-like and spiritual experiences, hence the alternative names of psychotomimetic and entheogenic. In our paper, we really just accept the consensus that psychedelics model both aspects of incipient psychosis and spiritual experience. Now, most studies examining serotonin 2A receptor binding in psychosis, if anything, show a downregulation of the receptor. We suggest this downregulation might be due to recent or continued activation of the receptor. So it's a compensatory downregulation. But there are only a few pieces of evidence supporting this hypothesis. So for instance, in one study of first episode psychosis, the severity of positive psychotic symptoms was associated with reduced 2A receptor binding. Also, 2A receptor binding has been found to be reduced in anorexia in a couple of studies, and there is overlap between anorexic and psychotic phenotypes. So for instance, some people going into a psychosis will stop eating. Now, of course, we can't capture endogenous spiritual experience in the lab very easily, and if we can, it's a meditative state. Aside from the possible effects of breath manipulation, I reckon a meditation-induced spiritual experience is more relatable to sensory deprivation, and if you want a pharmacological model, maybe NMDA receptor hypofunction, which might also be a downstream consequence of massive 2A receptor activation. But we can leave that discussion aside, meditative states aside. The couple pieces of evidence relating endogenous serotonin 2A function to spiritual experience are a couple of studies that found one SNP of the serotonin 2A gene is associated with trait absorption and time dilation. Both trait absorption and time dilation are implicated in spiritual experiences. Time dilation, for instance, is implicated in near-death experiences, which often feature spiritual themes. Maybe some of you have been in a car crash where time seems to pass very slowly, and you can relate to this. In any case, all in all, there is decent evidence that the 2A receptor is involved in spiritual experience and psychosis and endogenous pivotal mental states more generally. Now, I mentioned earlier that we would return to the question of how the schizotypal prodrome and mania might both converge on a common psychotic experience. And here's a really brief explanation of how this might work. So in Route 1, the schizophrenia path, activation of cortical 2A receptors sensitizes the mesolimbic dopamine system. And eventually, the 2AR might be downregulated, but the dopamine dysregulation continues. And so this Route 1 is shown in the figure on the right that I borrowed from Stahl 2018. Now, Route 2 is quite hypothetical and based on a couple recent findings that indicate increased dopaminergic signaling can also lead to increased activation of serotonin 2A receptors. So for one, selective serotonin 2A receptor antagonists can ameliorate hallucinations in Parkinson's disease psychosis, which is caused by dopamine-enhancing drugs. Also, chronic amphetamine administration upregulates and sensitizes 2A receptors. And there is preliminary evidence that dopamine itself acts as a partial agonist at the 2A receptor. That the 2A receptor is involved in dopamine-induced psychoses and manic psychoses makes more sense when one considers that low doses of dopamine-enhancing drugs don't produce noticeable psychedelic or psychotic effects. And that mania, which is often triggered by goal-driven behavior, becomes noticeably more psychedelic as it intensifies. Now, some of these effects could be indirect. For instance, dopamine-induced sleep deprivation could increase 2A receptor signaling. This hypothetical Route 2 is just worth mentioning due to the fact that the dopamine hypothesis of psychosis is so prominent. So now that we have provided some evidence that stress upregulates serotonin 2A receptor expression and activity, and that activation of 2A receptors is implicated in pivotal mental states, we can ask, what is the function of pivotal mental states? We propose that massive activation of serotonin 2A receptors, either by endogenous serotonin or endogenous psychedelics, can promote radical adaptation in context of chronic or massive stress. This adaptation would, of course, be mediated by learning processes and underlying changes in brain activity and/or microstructure. There is some evidence that psychedelics increase certain forms of learning and extinction learning, and one could see how this might be adaptive in the context of extremely threatening experiences. So you would want to disproportionately learn from these experiences so your behavior changed accordingly and you're not stuck in the same predicament in the future. So to provide an example, 10 dogs could lick me all over and I could be a dog person, but then if one dog nearly rips my throat out, I might change my perspective and behavior accordingly. This type of drastic learning in response to extreme threat is covered in Murnane's 2019 review, which focuses on the possible role of the serotonin 2A receptor in PTSD. So we say that PiMS, or pivotal mental states, are characterized by an enhanced rate of associative learning, but maybe we should have been more careful with this definition, as associative learning is often operationalized to capture learning in response to a new stimulus. And in many psychedelic experiences, a lot of the significant learning that occurs cannot be measured experimentally because it involves the integration and reappraisal of emotional memories and thought contents. But in any case, learning occurs and is hypothetically subserved by neuroplasticity. So we cite evidence that psychedelics increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the cortex, which is an indicator of increased structural neuroplasticity. We don't, however, delve deeply into how psychedelics affect processes associated with functional neuroplasticity, such as long-term depression or long-term potentiation. This is partially because we have a lot to learn collectively in this domain. So to recap, the idea is that serotonin 2A receptor activation potentiates these pivotal mental states that serve the adaptive function of 1, increasing learning in response to specific threatening stimuli or contexts. So for instance, a near-death experience or a traumatic event. And 2, promoting a more general reevaluation of life in response to a background of stress and suffering. So this background of stress could be the mental stress of losing a loved one, losing status, lacking purpose, or future-oriented anxiety associated with any number of things. So what are some therapeutic implications of this model? Firstly, let's consider that there may be no therapeutic advantage to viewing things this way. We definitely don't recommend psychiatrists stop prescribing antipsychotic drugs for psychosis. We don't recommend psychedelic or spiritual guides scare people away from beneficial transformative experiences. In some ways, our model introduces complexity and uncertainty at the level of actually treating people. And belief in a treatment modality can have significant impact on outcome. Nevertheless, understanding the potential risks and benefits associated with psychedelic therapy and recreational use of psychedelics will become increasingly important as these drugs become more accessible. We highlight in our paper the essential importance of context in shaping the quality and outcome associated with pivotal mental states. So on the right, we have a diagram that shows first on top how a background of stress and current adversity can potentiate a transformative experience that leads to a negative functional outcome. In this scenario, we can't change people's past, but we can endeavor to create incredibly supportive current environments that also positively encourage people to embrace a certain degree of adversity as a means towards growth. I've worked as a wilderness therapy instructor for a number of years, and these are the types of environments that we attempt to design for adolescents and young adults. Now, in the case of psychedelic therapy, you can induce the pivotal state without extreme stress. The benefit to this is that you can help people modify their perspectives, beliefs, and behaviors before their situation becomes particularly dire. We don't necessarily need to wait for pathological problems to arise or for people to hit rock bottom before we try to help them adapt in positive ways. we could use psychedelic therapy as a prophylactic measure to prevent the emergence of ingrained psychological problems in the first place. Another question worth asking is, how do we promote positive, pro-social, and enduring psychological change? So psychedelics probably have inherent antidepressant effects. But in the short term, one could argue that incipient psychosis and mania are also kind of antidepressant states in and of themselves. We want to help people change their beliefs and behaviors in ways that help mitigate the recurrence of distress long into the future. But this raises questions like, should mental health professionals promote values, such as humility, that protect against the development of nonconformist and grandiose beliefs? So nonconformist and grandiose beliefs might be appealing in the short term, have short-term antidepressant effects, but have negative consequences on long-term mental health. I've been thinking about this because it seems to me that the processes involved in discrete and intense pivotal mental states, such as spiritual experience and psychosis, are also involved in processes of value change more generally. For instance, think about radicalization. Psychological models of radicalization propose that a background of stress predisposes certain individuals to be radicalized. Intense stress then leads to a reconstrual of the self and subsequent fixation on ideas associated with this newfound identity. You will realize here that we seem to be getting sidetracked and moving away from the therapeutic domain, but on the other hand, can we really talk about mental health holistically without considering the societal values and socioeconomic conditions that impact mental health? In any case, we will leave these societal and philosophical implications for future discussion. All right, that's what I have. Thank you for listening to that.
Thank you very much, Ari.